Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Department of Politics and International Studies here at Cambridge. I'm Jude Brown, the current head of department, and it's my great pleasure to be opening the inaugural lecture of Duncan Kelly, who has recently been elected as the new Professor of Politics, following Andrew Gamble and David Runciman, who are both here this evening. It's lovely to see you both, and welcome back. The university's Professor of Politics was first established in 2012 by a Trinity College donation and is one of the most distinguished positions in political studies, linking the university's historic tradition of political thought with contemporary global debate in the context of POLIS's purposefully pluralistic intellectual identity. Duncan began his academic career at the University of Sheffield before joining Cambridge in 2007, and his work brilliantly bridges political theory, intellectual history, and modern political economy, and is especially known for examining how political ideas develop during periods of crisis and transformation. His major works include The State of the Political, The Propriety of Liberty, Politics and the Anthropocene, and his most recent 2025 book, Worlds of Wartime, The First World War and the Reconstruction of Modern Politics. What makes Duncan's work so significant is his ability to connect historical political thought with urgent modern questions, from empire and democracy to war, ecology and global order. Duncan's inaugural lecture this evening is entitled Seeing Things Politically. He'll adopt the usual format for a Cambridge inaugural of an hour's lecture, followed immediately by a drinks reception, no formal Q&A. And those who are going to King's afterwards, you must be there by 7, please. So all that's left to say is join me in welcoming Duncan Kelly as the new Professor of Politics here at Cambridge.
Thank you all so very much for coming. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to see you all. And thank you, Jude, for such a lovely introduction. This department is a very unusual one. It appointed me as a chair, but it's a very unusual one in the sense that it is more pluralistic than most politics departments in the country, I think, and around the world. It adopts more of a skeptical, historical approach to the study of politics. It has developed over the long run, but is a relatively new department still. And as Professor of Politics, as Jude said, I'm just the third in line. And in many ways, this department, this building, this place is still sort of developing. And I'd like to thank everyone who I'm here with, working with, in the department, such a bunch of wonderful colleagues, amazing support staff who make all of this and these kind of events happen. So thank you to them all, and particularly to Chloe, who put together the PowerPoint for me. And there will be some pictures, so if you get bored of listening to me, there'll be plenty you can look at. But in particular, this department has developed under the direction of a suite of brilliant heads of department over the past 15, 20 years, including Chris Hill, Andrew Gamble, David Runciman, Jason Sharman, and Jude Brown. And it's all going downhill because I'm next. But apart from that, I really wanted to pay tribute to the two heads of departments and the two predecessors in this chair before I get going this evening, as is sort of customary in inaugural lectures. And in the part of the academic world that I'm most familiar with, which is the history of political ideas and political theory and intellectual history, people often tell the history of their discipline with reference to inaugural lectures. And once upon a time, figures like Ernest Barker, who were chairs in political science, but in the history department here, set the tone for thinking about what the relationship between politics and history and the study of political thought and intellectual history might be. they moved through figures like Harold Lasky, Graham Wallas, Michael Oakeshott, around these parts and in London, to people like Quentin Skinner, Gareth Stedman Jones, John Robertson, now Richard Burke, as chairs in the history of political thought in Cambridge. But in terms of politics, and in terms of the Department of Politics, Andrew and David have really set the tone for how this place has become known for studying the experience of politics as life within and under a state, a modern nation state. And indeed, they focused on ways in which the experience of life under a state might help understand the limits of politics. And experience and the experience of politics and the experience of politics under a state is precisely the sort of topic that Harold Lasky set out in 1926, almost a century ago, in his own inaugural lecture, when he talked about what he called the study of politics. But his expertise in the history of political thought was that he wanted to write a specific set of reflections on the experience of living under a state, the experience that came from living under a state and the form of words and the sorts of ideas that people could think about when they thought about politics as a sort of discipline. And I think that as those inaugural lectures developed, Michael Oakeshott succeeded Harold Lasky in London, and in 1951, when he gave his own inaugural lecture on political education, what he also worked towards was a sense that politics and the study of politics should be about the languages through which communities come to understand their own attempts to live together politically. And in so doing, they form a set of reflections about experience of life under a state. And Oakeshott was particularly generous to his predecessors, not something he was usually known for, but he was particularly generous in singling out Graham Wallas and Harold Lasky as figures who had exciting and stabilizing things to say about the study of politics and intellectual history. And I've been tempted, thinking about inaugural lectures over the last few months, to crib from Oakeshott's generosity here as a way of praising my own two predecessors in this chair. And Andrew Gamble, I've known for nearly 30 years now, which makes me feel pretty old. Andrew was once upon a time my PhD supervisor. And before he came to Cambridge to take up the role of the Professor of Politics and help make this department and this building come together in the form that it has, he embodies a sort of an intellectual warmth and a calm, steadying hand and support, with a clarity of vision about how to understand politics through distinctive traditions of political economy, political institutions, political theory, and a sort of left Marxism, which remains entirely distinctive, I think. His own inaugural lecture here on the limits to politics laid it out with a lightness of touch, which belied a sort of serious range and a depth which was and is a style all of his own. I'm hugely grateful to him personally and politically. And I certainly wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for him. So thank you, Andrew. And similarly, David, who was on the appointments panel, who appointed me. So it's sort of on you. But that was a long time ago. But David, whose capacity to take problems and propositions from the history of political thought and apply them imaginatively to a wide range of contemporary questions, has been endlessly fertile and intellectually exciting, both while he was in this department and subsequently. The call back to people like Graham Wallas and Barker and Lasky could be found indeed in his own doctoral thesis in the first book, Pluralism and the Personality of the State, which was also published nearly 30 years ago and was hugely inspirational for me, thinking about how one might make connections between theories of the state, theories of politics, and the experience of living under a state. And how one might make sense, as he put it in his own inaugural lecture, of what the limits to politics, the realistic forms of politics might be in the age of the internet. To follow them, as Oakeshott said about following his own predecessors, is to be reminded very severely of one's own limitations. And as Oakeshott said, I can only try to do my best. So that's what I'm going to do. And now, for something completely different. So what happens when we think about the experience of living under a state or living politically together, when states no longer seem to have the kind of capacity that maybe they once did for thinking about some of the most pressing global problems and the most pressing limits to politics that we face in the present? And one of those calamitous, complex presents is, how do we think about climate change, climate catastrophe, and politics and the experience of politics living in an era of the Anthropocene, so-called. And this is one version of an image from the Geological Survey, the US Geological Survey, of the entire geological history of planet Earth, where, and I've put a little arrow here for those of you who've got difficulty with your eyes, there's a little surfer just at the end of the Holocene here, just as we're about to fall into, or they're about to fall into, the Anthropocene, the unknown. And the Anthropocene, of course, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the thought that because of human agency over the last 50 to 200, or even the entire planetary history of the Earth, for our agency over all of this time has transformed the Earth to such an extent that human beings have become geological agents, and we've shifted from a stable climatic Holocene era into the era of the Anthropocene. And the era of the Anthropocene is a sort of wicked problem for contemporary politics. When did it emerge? How do we think about it? How do we connect an entire geological history of planetary politics and planetary life to contemporary short-term political challenges? Can we even agree on what it is? I'll come back to that right at the end, because it turns out that we can't. And how do we connect the long-term history of fossil fuel use, of carbon degradation on the planet, the cycles of carbon that renew themselves over such long terms that they allowed for the breakup of hyper-mega continents like Gondwanaland millennia ago, which created the conditions for fossil capitalism and European imperial expansion over the last 500 years. How do we bring these sorts of connections together in order to make sense of our politics? And how relatedly can we learn to deal with the problem that the engineer Peter Haff has called the technosphere that runs alongside the Anthropocene? And what's the technosphere? The technosphere relates to the idea, or refers to the idea, that some 30 to 40 trillion tons of material that human beings have built over the course of their life on Earth, from dwellings and foundations through to the networks that make this kind of presentation possible, that now have their own autonomous systemic logic, which means that we can't just turn them off. How does the weight of the technosphere, which is some order of magnitude heavier than the biomass of the Earth, and operates on a scale that singular human beings can readily, or not readily at all, actually comprehend and reason with and understand? But how do we see the politics of the technosphere, just in the same way that I raised the challenge a minute ago of how we frame the challenge of the Anthropocene? And here, this is a vision that actually embodies quite an extensive political backstory. This is a sculpture by the Belgian artist Martin van den Ende, who took rocks from the Belgian Congo, and those of you who know the history of the relations between Belgium and the Congo will see the point of some of this later on. But that connection, the use of the rocks from the Democratic Republic of Congo and the production by a Belgian artist of an image of the technosphere, the new fossils that our future generations will uncover, perhaps, a sort of an old-style Nokia smartphone embedded in a rock, that suggests something about the long-term consequences of technological development, that sees technological artifacts as something that have histories, and sees those histories as connecting to international relations and geopolitics, the way in which, for example, the legacy of imperialism is entrenched in the fossilized record. And here the connection between Belgium and the Congo is made plain. And there are some new ways of seeing these sorts of politics around the networks and planetary sort of scaled sovereignty of cloud computing that you can find written about by Benjamin Bratton in a brilliant book that's just had its 10th anniversary edition called The Stack, A Planetary Architecture of Cloud Computing and the Network, that holds together the world, the information world in which we live in. And if you want to be terrified of all of this, you can look at his website called Antikythera, which takes the implications of human beings as geological agents and makes the claim that technology is advancing to such an extent, so rapidly, that our concepts, our old political concepts, our old technological concepts, no longer are fit for purpose. We don't even know what to call the kind of world we're living in. We don't really understand what sort of concepts we have that might frame it, that might understand it for us. And one result of that might be that our politics has just turned into pure spectacle. This is the kind of thing that T.J. Clark often writes about in the London Review of Books, for example, where Trump is just the arbiter of global politics, working with no constraints other than the arbitrary whim of what he happens to find moral or compelling at any particular moment. But that sense that there's no real concept, there's no real stable or stabilizing set of concepts in politics that we can turn to make sense of our present, to make sense of the technosphere, to make sense of the Anthropocene, leaves people who teach politics and intellectual history and who think about the study of the history of political thought and its relevance for the present in a bit of a bind. And then they have to give an inaugural lecture. So, what I wanted to try and do was to talk about some of the ways in which we might return to art and art history as ways of beginning to see things politically in this context of our difficult present. But because it's Cambridge and because it's politics, we might as well start with Hobbes. Don't worry, I'm not going to say very much about Hobbes. I just want to put it up here that although we lack lots of concepts or we struggle to engage conceptually with the politics of the present, we still often find ourselves, particularly in political thought and intellectual history, running back to Hobbes. And not only because we live in a world of seemingly perpetual war, where some version of a Hobbesian stable present seems to have fallen away for us, but also because he offers us such a complicated way of seeing politics that's just endlessly fascinating. The sense that the person of the sovereign, the natural person of the sovereign, can represent the body of the people, however so constituted. And that can represent them by artifice or by fiction, despite of them being a natural person. And that we see here that politics is a story that sort of connects religious authority and civil authority. Politics is a form of power that is supposed to rule over country and city, that's supposed to divide, that's supposed to wall off the natural world and its dangers from the civil world of politics. And in some ways, all of this seems to have broken down to me. But in other ways, it still seems absolutely central to the way we want to think about politics and the way in which we start talking about politics. And for early modern historians and early modern cultural theorists and intellectual historians, the iconography of Hobbes's Leviathan and other frontispieces of similarly famous works in the study of the political thought, have been mined for the way in which they tell us something about politics, so that we can move from the visual to the understanding of politics quite straightforwardly. And that raises interesting questions about the status of art and artifacts and frontispieces in this case particularly, as evidence, and as evidence that can move and that can develop depending upon the sorts of questions we ask about it moving forward, and how those images and iconographic details might change over time depending upon what we ask of them. But it's always puzzled me, and it's puzzled me since I've been in this place too. Why don't political theorists, modern political theorists, that is, use images more than they do to think about the history of modern political thought? And that's the subject of the research that I'm trying to undertake going forward now, and it's about that I'd like to talk to you a little bit this evening. As Jude said, as this is an inaugural lecture, there'll be no questions afterwards. So if I'm wrong, you've got the next 10, 15 years maybe to come back and tell me. But there will also be drinks, obviously, straight afterwards. But the first thing I need to do, and the first thing in order to get this going, really, is to get out from under Hobbes's shadow. And I've been thinking about which political theorists over the last 50 years or so may have been trying more to do that than others. And one who came back to my mind, who I hadn't read for a very long time, was Sheldon Wolin, whose famous book from early 1960 called Politics and Vision presented a case for the task of political theory as being involved with setting out the imaginative visual space within which politics takes place, such that we could begin to understand it. The task of the political theorist, though for Wolin, linguistically, the task of the political theorist in the language that they use was to set out a perspective through which we might see politics. That's as far as the visual goes, though it has been hugely influential, particularly for certain North American political theorists who are interested in thinking about political theory as either providing architectonic forms of or frameworks for understanding politics, so how we might go back to Plato or Hegel in Wolin's sense, and in the way he's influenced some of these generations of modern political theorists, to understand politics as a situated set of judgments within this large perspective or vision. And we might also see politics for Wolin as forms of collective action in particular moments. And so we might look to the images of collective action. We might look to the pictures of revolution and to images of terror, in his case, thinking about the aftermath of 9/11 particularly, for understanding politics too. So politics can be framed, and the way of seeing it is through the metaphors that come through the language of politics. And he was very scathing, although also very obsessed with the politics that comes from thinking about Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes, as he wanted to say in 1970 when he gave a talk in Los Angeles on Hobbes and the epic tradition of political theory, was that where you end up with, if you follow Hobbes for the study of modern politics, is with the sublimation of politics. The politics becomes about organization and management rather than politics as collective struggle and a new sort of vision for the future. The vision of politics that Hobbes gives you, according to Wolin, is an anti-hero's utopia. A utopia for those who wish to be rid of the anxieties, he said, produced by political instability. And it's an attempted epitaph to politics. So it was a short step then, even though it took him 40 years to get there, from Politics and Vision to Democracy Incorporated, where he worried about the sort of inverted totalitarianism of modern contemporary politics. The other figure who I've been interested in for a long time, who was trying for a very long time themselves to get out from under the shadow of Hobbes and Hobbes's legacy, was Hannah Arendt. And in The Human Condition, with its triptych of sort of conceptual concerns with the division of the human condition into labor, work, and action, where action is the sphere of plurality, and plurality is the determinative feature of politics and the political, is something that looks rather different to the Hobbesian vision of politics. Politics for Arendt is about performance or performativity. Politics for Arendt is about being together in public with others. It's dangerous, it's risky. You might find yourself in positions like this wondering, what is the audience really thinking? But in the nuclear age, when she published The Human Condition in 1958, she said a few interesting things. She said the most radical change that the human condition could imagine would be imagining that you could leave the world, emigrating off planet, a sort of theme that keeps coming back the more and more we hear about Elon Musk and his plans to colonize Mars. The worry of this being the end of politics, not better politics for the future, is something that Arendt was very much aware of early on. She was also obsessed with what she called the permanence of the world and the work of art, a section of the book which I keep trying to make sense of. And this, what follows for most of the rest of the lecture, will be an attempt to make good on a claim that she puts forward in that book, and I'm just going to quote it here. She says, among the things that give the human artifice the stability without which it could never be a reliable home for me or for men, are a number of objects which are strictly without any utility whatsoever, therefore not exchangeable in the usual way, and if they enter the exchange market, they can only be arbitrarily priced. The proper intercourse, she says, with a work of art is certainly not using it. It needs to be removed from the ordinary use objects that make up our daily lives and away from the exigencies and wants of daily life. And it is as though, she says, worldly stability had become transparent in the permanence of art. Now, what did she mean by that? And what might I mean by that? Well, poetry might help us think about what she meant. And it's no surprise that her friend Wystan Auden blurbed The Human Condition. And I don't know of any other work in the history of political thought that's actually been blurbed by a poet like that, but maybe there are some. But Auden was someone who was interested in the way, obviously, that poetry, in his famous rendition from September 1st, 1939, poetry makes nothing happen, but it survives. And it survives in those places that executives would never want to tamper, he says. But in surviving in those places, it also provides us with a framework for thinking about transmission. And I think that the transmission of art and the transmission of poetry for Arendt and for Auden go together. And that puts the task of political theory and the task of seeing things politically in a slightly different register. And this image is an image that came to me when I was reading one of my favorite modern poets, Derek Mahon. This will begin to make sense. There's a Wittgenstein connection that's about to come. But Derek Mahon's poem called Tractatus, which some of you may know, but I'm just going to read a bit of it to you here. The world is everything that is the case, from the fly giving up in the coal shed to the winged victory of Samothrace. Here it is. Give blame, praise to the aged God who hides shamefacedly his aged face and whose light hides behind its veil of cloud. And then Mahon continues. He says, the world, though, is also so much more, everything that is the case imaginatively. And Tacitus thought that mariners could hear the sun sinking into the western sea. And who would question that titanic roar, smoke rising up wherever the dust may be? And for those of you who know your Wittgenstein as well as your Mahon, the opening line there, the world is everything that is the case, is the opening line to Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And the Tractatus is a bewildering sort of attempt to understand the limitations of how far language can express anything about the nature of the world. And if the world is everything that is the case for Wittgenstein, and the world is everything that is the case in Mahon's beginning of this poem, there's a sense in which all you can do with language is provide a picture of the world. This is what Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus. And it will only be a picture of the world that makes sense to us if it's accurate, if it accurately describes the world as it actually is. It's a closed language for the austerely modernist Tractatus that Wittgenstein writes up during the First World War, in between heroically fighting on the Western Front and, in some bizarre moments, sort of measuring his own solo sexual desires and fantasies. But the claim that language can only be useful if it provides a picture of the world means that it can't offer ethical or aesthetic arguments about the world, because these are not facts, he says. And their attempts to offer aesthetic and ethical claims about the world remain mystical, perhaps like Mahon's God hiding his face. And the early Tractatus version of Wittgenstein therefore means, perhaps unfortunately for you, perhaps fortunately for me, the thought that you might even be able to say that this is, or was, or might be a decent lecture probably makes no sense at all. But having thought about that, and having thought about its limitations, and having thought about the epic transmission of art and language and understanding through time that can be configured in this statue, the Winged Victory of Samothrace from 190 BCE, discovered by a Frenchman. Now it's in the Louvre, discovered in 1863. This sense that language and art and durability and transmission might require more than a merely closed language that makes sense only to individuals in the austerely modernist sense of the Tractatus, pushed Wittgenstein, and it certainly pushed Mahon, to think more imaginatively about language and poetry and politics. That language and art for Wittgenstein became forms of life rather than sort of private, closed things. And as forms of life, language, and this has been absolutely central to the study of political thought, particularly in this university, in this place, language is a form of action. And as a form of action, utterances, words, and concepts are deeds. And if in the beginning was the deed, then in the beginning was the act, and the act was the word. And there's something about that thought that motivates the kind of linguistic contextualism that's been so central to Cambridge political theory. But I also think that there's something missing in this, in the sense that while the study of language and the study of political thought has gone together in Cambridge, the study of art and images hasn't. And if poetry and durability of art might get us somewhere in thinking about that, how might we begin to think about making good on that Arendtian claim of what would it look like to think about the durability of the world and the durability of art as a way of making sense of it, particularly in a world of the Anthropocene where our concepts no longer make reliable sense of the politics of the world? What might we learn from thinking about some classic debates and arguments and developments in modern art and modernist art? And that's what I want to spend the rest of my time thinking about. How we move from the idea of words as deeds and actions to pictures that might be understood as words and deeds and actions. They might be texts that are there to be read. And in the same way that alongside Wittgenstein, the philosophy of J.L. Austin has been so central to the development of political thought in this place, how one does things with words, how one performs actions through words, so have art historians and historians of the image. There is a difference, but I won't get into it. People like Horst Bredekamp, the German art historian, have, instead of thinking about Austin-style speech acts for the previous generation of their work, have been thinking about image acts and the ways in which images have duration. And the duration of the image transforms the way in which we might ask questions about it moving forward. So what looked to be a series of stable questions about art at one period no longer necessarily have to be stable questions about art in our own. There's an anthropology to images and an anthropological foundation to the image act. This has been crucial to cultural historians and to some intellectual historians. It's been crucial to those who've been influenced by the work of Alfred Gell, or Gell, for example, on thinking about images as distributed objects, the kinds of partial entities that can offer different sorts of frameworks for understanding what societies might mean when they talk to themselves about the experience of living together politically, but they do so with reference to the art that makes sense of the world to them, rather than to language only or traditions of politics. We might also think about the image as something then that moves through time, the kind of thing that was so central to the polyglot neurasthenic art historian Avi Warburg, whose legacy is profound, but who is hardly discussed by anyone who writes on the history of modern political thought. And Warburg, in particular, took his cue from thinking about the legacies of the past in the present in the way that political theorists and historians of political thought all too familiarly do, but he did so with reference to images. The legacy of the Renaissance, for example, in the constitutive elements of politics and culture in the present, in the late 19th and early 20th century in Germany for him. The way in which one might discover something about modernity through undertaking studies of, in his case, indigenous populations in the American South and learning about images in movement from studying the Pueblo Indians, for example, about whom there's an entire politics around this, of course, because the way in which Warburg thought about using indigenous populations and their histories and cultures to explain contemporary politics and art in Europe was deeply problematic. But he didn't think so, and his contemporaries didn't, but we do. And so, the Warburg Institute now in London won't sanction the reproduction. And that's not why they're not here. You can easily find them online, just like you can find anything. But the Warburg Institute won't sanction the reproduction of these images that Warburg took of snake dances and rituals in the 1890s and 1895, 1896, because the questions and the context have changed. The image act might still have resonance for us, but what we can do with it and how we can see it or how we can't see it but might still talk about it are important elements of what Warburg still would want to call, I think, the pathos formel, or the sort of the pathetic legacies in some ways of the relationship between past and present that come from thinking about images as the things that move. So we make our politics through what we see, and what we see moves through time. And what moves through time is not just ecology and environment, as we threaten to fall into the Anthropocene from that time spiral, but it's also the way in which we think about how we see our own politics. And these are, for art historians, sort of old and probably rather rudimentary questions. And there are old and rather rudimentary questions, in particular, about how we should understand modernism, or artistic modernism. And there's a standard story about modernist art and how it develops, and this picture is one of the ones that's central to the sort of standard story of European modernism. It's about how the transition from grand style portraiture to faceless, sort of quasi-sexless figures come to be a new way of understanding a self that's no longer stable. It's about ways in which the application of colour that might traditionally be used in landscapes can also then come to encompass and to embody and to express the personality of individuals and groups. It's about not being able to know exactly who's looking at whom, and it's about not being exactly sure of whether you're supposed to like looking at stuff like this or not. There's something erotic but there's something dangerous, there's something sort of carnal, and at the same time, something very distant. And there's a story here about modernism that emerges through the way in which certain particularly male painters paint women. It keeps going. There's another version in the National Gallery. But this is from 1900 through 1906. And then the real transition story tends to be told with reference to Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And so this is, if you read most standard books on modernist art history, this is the moment, this is the image. This is 1906-07, and this is the moment of rupture, where Picasso decides a couple of things, really. One, he's not going to go along with the ways in which sort of impressionist and post-impressionist art, as he understands it, have been pandering to a sort of middle-class clientele. Instead, he's going elitist, he's going abstract, and he's going to work with the dealers and the businessmen who will be able to sell this kind of material. There's something distinctive here about the audience for this. But there's also something clearly quite different about the way the figures are presented. These are figures of prostitutes, local prostitutes, but they're also figures who've been masked in particular ways and whose faces don't resemble contemporary figure painting in any meaningful way. And some of that has to do with the fact that in 1906, Picasso had been visiting the Museum of Ethnology in Paris. He was obsessed with what he discovered there in terms of the sheer variety and number of particularly African masks that were on show. And the problem of them being on show is a political problem that continues to haunt how we think about politics and memory and images in this. And it's why I'm not actually going to be showing any pictures of any of the masks. But there is a sense in which the masks themselves and the masking, the use of masks in order to deconstruct, as it were, the faces of these figures is part of a story about modern politics and modern art as masking individuals in particular ways. And again, there's something that's sort of fierce and vibrant and erotic about this, and Alice Mahon has written engagingly about this. But there's also something peculiarly political about it. Like, we see through masks. And there's something about the way in which what the art historian Michael Fried has called the move away from sort of grand style ambitious painting, as he called it, great portraits, towards the non-finish of Impressionism or the unfinished qualities of Cézanne and Picasso that give us part and parcel of the modern story of modern art. But there's also an ancient story about modernism. This is a still from an exhibition that was curated and catalogued by Herbert Reed, the famous anarchist and historian of art from the 1940s. This from the Institute of Contemporary Arts, 1948 through January 1949, at an exhibition that was called 40,000 Years of Modern Art. And the catalogue, which I have a copy of at home, the first image you see is Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon. And then it moves into a whole series of masks and pictures and images of what Reed and others would continue to call primitive art in comparison with modern art. And the sense here that modernism contains multitudes to the extent that it's ancient, as well as it's being modern, is part and parcel also, I think, of the story. And there's something about that that I want you to hold in your mind about how we might think about the problems of the Anthropocene as well. The extent to which the timescales here for thinking about the modern are both epic and vast, but also short and momentary. Masking clearly was crucial. The time scale was clearly crucial. this sort of exhibit is actually, or exhibition space is actually going on in the present. I went to the Quai Branly Chirac Museum a few weeks ago when I was in Paris, and they have another exhibition that sounds almost exactly like this, about African and oceanic art in French culture from 1913 to 1923. And you can see lots of the same images, the same masks, the same objects being rethought through again. The image act continues on into the present. And the politics and the questions that we ask about it continue to change. And the 40,000-year story of modern art also is related to the relatively recent, mid to late 19th century discovery of cave painting in Europe, the sense that Europe, as well as everywhere else, had its own primitive art, which was transformative and transfixed the idea of prehistory, to take the title of a recent book that I think is excellent by Maria Stavrinaki on this subject, who suggests that it transformed the ways in which Europeans saw their own past and their own history. So modern art was also ancient because it was discovered in the caves in Lascaux and Altamira in the 1860s. At the same time, or just around the same time, that of course geologists were uncovering ancient fossils and flints, which threw into question the idea of a sacred or biblical timeline through which one could understand modern history and modern politics. The geological expanse that was opened up by the fossil record, and the pictorial expanse that was opened up by the discovery of cave painting, transformed the way in which art historians and people interested in general in art thought about the politics and the historical time frame involved in understanding modernism. And that's something I really also want to try and bring to bear on how we think about problems of the Anthropocene. Sorry. These were just some other illustrations to take you back to this thought that something deep in the ground, something earthy, is actually central. The ancient quality of the earth is central to the discovery of modern politics and modernism. This is Cézanne in the quarries in Bibimus in France. Just a couple here. Illustrations of hyper-modernism, but connected to the idea of the ecology and the dense, non-human time span in which human beings actually have to think about their own life and their own politics. It's a problem of embodiment in lots of ways. Where are the people? I mean, there's one. But this is a world which doesn't require people. It's a world in the way that people often talk about the Anthropocene and the environmental crisis. The earth doesn't care about us, and the earth will be perfectly fine without us, but we obviously won't. So we have to think about ways in which we can try and orient ourselves within the world. Contemporary artists still continue to do this and think about the odd connection between their art and the experience of nature and the natural world. This spiral jetty by Robert Smithson, I'm sure you will have seen this famous image of it before, the basalt and the rocks that go out for 150 meters into the lake at Utah, but which very shortly after it was established as this piece of land art in 1970, it was sunk by the lake, not to be seen again for nearly 30 years, but now it's back. Climate has made it visible again, and climate change and the transformation of Earth independently of our artistic or our political engagement with it continues to try and sort of force us to see the world anew and to see things politically. There were also, going back a step, there were also sort of senses through the development of modern art history and modern intellectual history that something new was happening about form and content in art that was going to change the way people think about their politics. Virginia Woolf famously quipped, although in 1925, that on or about December 1910, human nature changed. And it changed in part because of the exhibition that Roger Fry curated in the Grafton Galleries, the post-impressionist exhibition, which was supposed to be an illustration of a new way of thinking about art and form, a new way of understanding the connections between modern art and modern politics. It wasn't universally accepted. This, I'll come back to Henry Tonks in a minute, but Henry Tonks was the famous and famously austere drawing instructor at the Slade Art School. But in the 20s, he satirized this moment of post-impressionism and the sort of Cézanne worship on the part of Roger Fry and Clive Bell, the modernist, by showing this picture of a sort of exaggerated Roger Fry doing his thing at the front of a lecture, holding a dead cat, saying that this is modern form, this is modern art. And if you can see in the side, you've got Clive Bell, the modern artist, ringing the bell that says, Cézanne, Cézanne. And it's as if there's this sort of sense that actually the focus on art and form and the focus on colour and post-impressionism and modernity is missing the point. That there's something stricter, there's something more formal about art that could tell us about politics still, but that we shouldn't sort of think about it in these ways. But that's the Cézanne version that still occupies such a pivotal position for modern art historians and modern intellectual historians who think about images. How do we understand, in T.J. Clarke's words, why is it that these apples continue to look like they're about to fall? What is it about the perspective, the shifting perspective and coloration of Cézanne's images that tells us something, that offers us a metaphor for understanding the uncertainties of positionality, of perspective, of place, that seem to me to be all too resonant for how we might think about the uncertainties, the positionalities, the gravitational pull or otherwise of particular forms of politics in the present. And if Cézanne offered a particular set of visions and Picasso offered a particular set of visions of modernism and modern art, this was a sense in which the human was deconstructed in some ways. But in the post-impressionist world of people like Seurat, about whom there have been many exhibitions recently, this is probably his most famous, apart from the Can-Can picture, this probably his most famous image, La Grande Jatte. And for Seurat, this seems to be the presentation of a world of harmony, a world at peace, a bourgeois world, but a world in which the Sunday afternoon is free for the workers as much as it's free for everyone else. Seurat's anarchism, Seurat's politics, and the modernity of his technique seem to come together here, that there's something about modern labor and something about modern techniques of color and precision and the pointillés, the dots that make up the pointilliste picture are something new. But if you read historians, if you read Marxist critics, if you read people like Linda Nochlin on this image, you get a rather different picture. Linda Nochlin wrote a brilliant essay on this picture by Seurat in a book called The Politics of Vision, where she called it an anti-utopian allegory, and she starts the discussion with a long quotation from Ernst Bloch, the famous Marxist philosopher, whose Principle of Hope has a long paragraph on how to understand Seurat. And for Bloch, and then for Linda Nochlin going forward, this is the picture of bourgeois suicide. This is the ultimate boredom of modern life and labor. What could be worse than this? The Sunday afternoon, where although you might be free from the shackles of the church, everything is about as stiff and rigid as you could possibly want. And what Nochlin does with the approach she calls the visceral eye, where she looks at this, not only from a straightforwardly feminist perspective, for which she's well known in art historical circles, but what she is trying to show is the way in which she reads Seurat as rejecting the utopianism of previous artists, rejecting the utopias of realism in the mid-19th century, the utopias of labour presented in the mid-19th century, and offering something new, an allegory about future possibilities, but ones that are fraught with danger, where if labour is not really free, this is the kind of world you might end up in. The kind of world in which everyone is perpetually on show, but nobody really looks like they're engaging with one another at all. It's a dangerous and a difficult world. And this is the sort of the paradox or the puzzle of modernism, and this is the paradox or the puzzle of modern politics. The human being has become a palace of industry, a sort of labour machine. And this is just an image from a book published in the 1920s, which I use in the book on the First World War that Jude mentioned I just recently published. It's in a book called Das Leben des Menschen by Fritz Kahn. And this sort of illustrates, I think, in a slightly more modernist style, the kind of argument that Nochlin is making about Seurat, the worry about labour, rather than making you free, just turns you into another machine. But there once was a dream that labour would make you free, the dream of a certain kind of modernism, the modernism that you can find in Elie Lissitzky's here famous suprematist image of Beat the Whites with the red wedge from 1919, where form has transformed politics into something visually decisive. You know, there's politics in the picture here. This is how you win. It's the red wedge. And it's a vision of what happens under a Bolshevik theory of labour. Labour will make you free. The workers will find freedom, and this will be their art form. And this is the sort of story, if you read someone like T.J. Clark again, that has died. The idea that modern politics, modernism, the avant-garde, political struggle, collective struggle through labour, the dream of 1917 through 1919 in Russia, that ended in 1989 with the end of history and Fukuyama. That was a blip. And the end of modernism is the end of politics, or the end of politics as revolutionary possibility. Indeed, the end of reformist politics even, because as Clark says in a famous essay, For a Left with No Future, if you can't even talk about reform in contemporary politics without the shutters coming down on you, then we've really lost the plot, and we really don't know what we're supposed to be doing anymore. Now, I want to say in the last 5 to 10 minutes that this really might be a move that's been made too quickly. And that for a world that finds itself in perpetual war, for a world that finds itself unable to think conceptually about its politics with any degree of stability, we might want to imagine a world once again in which we look back to the First World War and think about the way in which art and politics connected then as still having something to say to us. The politics isn't over, and the modernist moment maybe hasn't passed. And I think we can think about this in 3 or 4 ways. First, I wanted to talk about bodies. Here again, this is an image of Nudes in the Forest by Fernand Léger, one of the famous Parisian avant-garde artists. This is the forest in Verdun. It's just before the First World War, but it's an image where human beings, and nudes in particular, have become tubular forms. They've become like machines. They've become the images of mechanized individuals. And you can barely make out who's who. The perspective is complicated. The way into the picture is confusing. But it tells you something about the brittleness of the connections that are made between self, body, and mind that are absolutely central to the way we think about politics. There's a great book by a friend, Steph Yerolanos, and his colleague Todd Mayers, called The Human Body in an Age of Catastrophe, that was published a few years ago, that talks about exactly that kind of brittleness of the modernist project in and around understanding the human body. And Eric Michaud has done also excellent work on Léger to talk about the way in which the project of constructing new individuals, or indeed the project of constructing a new man or a new woman in modern art, is unthinkable without this development into the First World War, of the fragmentation of the body. That sort of thought runs its way through Wyndham Lewis and the vorticist interlude, particularly in Britain. Here you see the blast war number image of the human being as machine, the interconnection of human individuals with buildings, with the wider world around them, with technology driving them forward. But you also, with Lewis, in The Battery Shelled, another famous image of the First World War held at the Imperial War Museum still, you see something that connects very clearly with the sort of thing that Hannah Arendt was worried about, that I started an hour or so ago with the thought here that the three officers on this side of the picture are engaged in contemplative, passive response to the destruction all around them. For Lewis and for people like David Peters Corbett, who've done interesting work on Lewis and the First World War here, they also embody this sort of perspective that you might find in Renaissance portraiture connected with Piero della Francesca. You've got the sense of the wave that obsessed Lewis and the modernists as providing the background. But the thing that connects it to Hannah Arendt is that these figures are free. They have the capacity and the time to think. And the soldiers are busy running around, thoughtless, unable to think, engaged in action. And this distinction between contemplation and action is absolutely crucial to Arendt's vision of what it is to be free. In order to be free, one has to have the space to contemplate, one has to have the space to think, and that is what it means to be free. And this story, or this image from the First World War, might get us somewhere thinking about that. We might also think about faces. Henry Tonks again. This time Tonks, not the satirist of Cézanne, but Tonks, the pastoral portraitist of those wounded and facially disfigured soldiers in the First World War, from his Cambridge Military Hospital office in Sidcup, who drew these images in order to then provide the background and the memorial sense of what had happened to these individuals before they were reconstructed by the facemaker surgeon Harold Gillies. And the faces that are destroyed here and then reconstructed say something important, I think, about the way in which the sensory dimensions of the First World War and the sort of sensory dimensions of contemporary politics still continue to linger with us. And the way in which we see faces as masks, the modernist problem, and the way in which disfigured faces can be reconstructed and remasked is an important, both metaphoric as well as practical, illustration of the importance of understanding the face as the presentation of self that makes sense of politics as much as it makes sense of art. Is a very different version of that thought. The literal embodiment by 21,000 soldiers at Fort Sherman, or Camp Sherman in Ohio in 1918, of the face of Woodrow Wilson. This is Woodrow Wilson making the world safe for democracy. The modern Hobbesian update of the face that now includes the body of the people, when the body of the people are the soldiers who are fighting in the First World War and who are off to fight for the American vision of making a world safe for democracy. And this kind of vision of facial reconstruction as something that's hyper-modern is a weird and intriguing twist, it seems to me, on that classic division that Walter Benjamin made famous in his essays on art and history and politics, whereby he thought that what was really going on, and the division in modern politics, was that the fascists wanted to aestheticize politics, and the Bolsheviks and the radicals wanted to politicize aesthetics. And it's not clear to me what's going on here, but it seems to be a sort of mixture of both, a kind of quasi-Hobbesian corporate personality able to be reproduced in perpetuity in an age of mechanical and technical reproduction that says something about politics and says something about image and icon and image acts through time. Going quickly now. We might also think about wartime landscapes as telling us something about the present and present politics in terms of the way in which we understand environmental destruction. This is the sort of legacy that Paul Nash has made clear and vivid, and whose draft, Sunrise at Inverness Copse from 1918, was then made more famous in his oil painting with the rather cynical title, We're Making a New World. This is the forests around Ypres, where what's left of the natural world is an image of human-enforced destruction. But what you can begin to see with the sun, with its rays going around the curve of the earth, you can begin to see a sense that the natural world reconstructs over time. That despite what humans do to it, it will revive, renew, and be reborn. And that sense of the new world coming out of the old, the capacity for reconstruction, is something that motivated Nash as he moved forward into slightly more surreal forms of art in the 1930s, though some in which these log figures and then the two that are overlapping here like a cross are themselves memorials to the missing and the dead of the war, which becomes increasingly uncanny in the 1930s as he becomes obsessed with megaliths and ancient forms of art and sculpture in the British Isles and puts them into fields like this. But then when another war comes along, he finds his métier again. And you begin to get this sense of the life of objects being part and parcel of the life of landscapes. This is Dead Sea, Todesmeer, where the sea is made up of crashed German airplanes from 1941. So the landscape that lives, the landscape that combines with objects, the objects and the landscape that project their images and their memories to us in the present, still live on, as do the worlds through which we think about politics, and this will be the last bit. I wanted just to take you back to this image from 1900, from the Paris Universal Exposition. This is the famous celestial globe on the right that was in part designed by the radical anarchist geographer Élisée Reclus, but which presented an image of the world at the Universal Exposition, where the nations of the world all came together to present their wares and present their modernity to the world. But what kind of world was made by the First World War, and for whom, is still a question that matters very much for us. These are a series of images from the African-American sociologist, cultural writer, critic, historian, polymath, editor of the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois. And in that 1900 exposition at the Palace of Social Economy, he presented a series of visualizations of modern politics, and in particular about the modern experience of being black in America, for the understanding of the problem that he had diagnosed a few years earlier, of the problem of the 20th century, which was the division of the world along the global color line. And these images on the left and the right are about ways in which he drew in order to visualize the global and the local dynamics of population developments and the development of a particular kind of freedom post-emancipation for black populations in the American South, in this case in Georgia, on the right-hand side. But what he's trying to get us to see, of course, is that you can't understand the racialized elements of international politics and domestic American politics without putting it in a global perspective. So you can't understand population change and development and wealth accumulation and freedom in Georgia without understanding the backstory of the Middle Passage, the trajectory of enslavement, and the way in which the world was constructed through an imperial arc from, in this case, from the 19th century through to the 20th, but it goes back much further, and this is why I wanted to put the bit in the middle here about the Christmas crisis and what else W.E.B. Du Bois was doing in 1915. So the journal, The Crisis, that Du Bois edits from 1900 through into the 1920s and early 30s, is a modernist journal of the NAACP. It becomes increasingly vibrant in its production, and this is just one illustration. But in 1915, what Du Bois also does is write for the Atlantic Monthly an essay called The African Roots of War. And what he shows in that essay is that war came to Europe from the global south to the north. The standard story about the origins of the First World War obviously is that it's an intra-European dispute that's grounded in imperialism, but it's a story about war coming from Eastern Europe to West, a story about national self-determination, local conflicts that reverberate around the world and then go global. Du Bois's thought is that the war was already global. It was always global because of European imperial exploits in the African continent. And in particular, when he writes in the Atlantic Monthly in 1915, he's showing that the nemesis of German soldiers marching through Belgium is what follows from the hubris of Belgian acquisitions of resources and the colonization of peoples in the Congo in the 1870s. So he expands the chronology of the war. It runs from the 1870s at least. But it's globally reconstructed. It runs from the global south to the global north. And here's where I want to end. It doesn't end. According to Du Bois, the war doesn't finish. And the war doesn't finish because the promise of Wilson with the face and the world being made safe for democracy, that never comes true. That never happens in America. So when soldiers return back to America in 1918, 1919, they suffer virulent racism. The promise of racial equality is no longer present. In fact, things get worse rather than better. And Du Bois keeps thinking about this over and over from the 1920s into the 1930s. And the First World War, according to Du Bois, never ends. So the modernist vision of how we see politics, how we visualize politics in global perspective that he's doing and undertaking in 1900 is part of a story that will become an analysis of the First World War, that will be expansive, that will be epic in its timeframes, and that will be unfinished in its futures. And that lesson about racial politics, international or geopolitical interconnection, visions of the world, and a world in crisis, a world in which humans have become geological agents, in which their concepts no longer seem fit for purpose, seems to me an eerie, if not an uncanny, hangover from the First World War and from the kind of lessons that Du Bois was trying to get us to think about back then. And so if there's a way of learning how to see things politically, we could do a lot worse than go back to some of these periods around the First World War and try and make sense of why it's so difficult to do anything differently with our politics in the present, when we still seem to be so stuck in the past, even though the context of our past has now become an Anthropocene with an epic future, which seems almost impossible to comprehend. So seeing things politically turns out to be a mess. And that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.